Brought to you by Squarespace, this video is. Never again, this voice I will do. Despite being a Star Wars fan, I don't understand the tradition others have whenever a new movie comes out, which is writing negative reviews without having seen the movie. It's like everyone lives on the planet Crate.
Salt.
Just a little sodium chloride.
Actually, dude, it's salt.
That's what I said, sodium chloride.
Dude, that would be salt.
After a few years of this blind negativity towards the newest films, I was surprised to learn that the lowest rated movie wasn't from the prequel trilogy, or produced while Disney has owned the brand. All of those have average to good review scores, so what could it be? That's not a real Star Wars movie, that's a cartoon! As a lead-in for the animated series, Lucasfilm and Warner Brothers released the feature film Star Wars The Clone Wars, or as I like to call it, Star the Clone Wars Wars. Not to be confused with Star Wars The Clone Wars, Star Wars The Clone Wars, and Star Wars Clone Wars. The series that followed this film would become so expansive and acclaimed that it survived Disney's acquisition of the franchise and is just now beginning its 7th and final season. But upon this film's release, it received mediocre reviews, and it currently holds the franchise's lowest critic scores and nearly lowest user scores across IMDb, Rotten Tomatoes, and Metacritic. Now to those who discredit this comparison by saying that the Clone Wars movie isn't a part of the mainline Skywalker saga, I say that doesn't matter. It's just as important to the canon as Rogue One and Solo, is easy to legally seek out unlike the Holiday Special or Ewok movies, and based on the comparisons critics made to the prequels, most treated this like another major Star Wars film. George Lucas also had his hand in developing it along with the subsequent show, before he ascended to a level of being where he can no longer be photographed. Unfortunately, Lucas might be the sole figure responsible for the poor reputation of this movie. I'm not trying to spite the guy like others have. Trust me, I would not want to mess with him. Most of the criticism leveled at this movie was directed at the animation. The characters look like wooden action figures and emote in just as stiff of a fashion. This was somewhat intentional, as Lucas took inspiration from the designs of Thunderbirds, a 60s sci-fi puppet show filmed in Super Mario Nation, which might also be the name of the next 3D Mario game. It's easy to make fun of now, but at the time it was uniquely in between live action and animation, and I think Lucas was trying to emulate a similar vibe here. To further understand the visuals, I think that we need to look at the Jimmy Neutron franchise. Trust me, this comparison is going somewhere. Like the Clone Wars, Jimmy Neutron also used a theatrical film to launch its cartoon. This means that the art and animation of both was built to serve both theatrical and television production upon their inceptions. Since the latter format requires much tighter deadlines that leave less room for creating assets and adding detail, the two movies ended up looking a lot worse than what DreamWorks or Pixar was putting out in each of their respective years. Now, as the adventures of Jimmy Neutron Boy Genius went on, the character animation and texturing definitely surpassed what was seen in its film. And the same can be said for the Clone Wars, in both cases due to a combination of new technology and the team's growing experience. I would even say that as far as long-form canonical Star Wars cartoons go, this would be my preferred art style, as it's not too cartoony, not too stylized, and doesn't remind me of something else. Although in some cases, that's not always a bad thing. If you compare the final episodes of Jimmy Neutron that aired less than 2 years before the debut of the Clone Wars, it's no contest which one looks better. The directing is also a lot stronger, and helps highlight how well lit the environments are. It's a shame that the plot begins on this small and empty stretch of a turquoise battlefield with poorly composited matte paintings in the background. Things get more visually interesting as the Republic heroes explore a monastery atop a rocky cliff, and later traverse across Tatooine as day turns to night. There's a few moments that use perspective or a shaky camera to remind the viewers that this is a war movie, which all the other films in this franchise technically are by name, but I wish there was a little more of that, since most of the staging is somewhat uninspired. What does help give the movie its own identity is the soundtrack by Kevin Kiner. It's got John Williams-inspired cues that you would expect, but it wasn't afraid to experiment with rock-inspired themes, operatic motifs, and some Eastern-sounding drums. It stays away from what you're expecting just enough that it becomes its own thing, so it works for what this movie is trying to do. I can't play much due to fear of getting a copyright claim, so here's a short snippet. I'm not too keen on the action though, as only one sequence sticks out to me. This vertical battle where the clones and titular Jedi ascend up the side of a cliff. It's the only one that uses the environment to its advantage. The other dogfights and lightsaber duels are fine, but they mostly blend together, or don't really further the overall plot. They're more realistic and have better editing than what you would find in the previous prequels, but for that reason, I don't think they're as interesting. The plot of this movie is about Anakin Skywalker babysitting Jabba's son. Okay, that comparison isn't entirely fair. He also babysits Ahsoka as well. Ahsoka Tano is Anakin's new Padawan, and she's grown to become a beloved character in this franchise, but she was hated upon introduction. Now this perspective I understand. Here, Ahsoka is a know-it-all that runs right into danger and barely respects Anakin as a leader. The movie wants to show how the pair learn to trust each other, as seen in the climax, where Ahsoka is trusted with returning Jabba's son all on her own. But briefly going their separate ways doesn't really display how much they've grown as characters together, especially when it seems like they only stop bickering when the plot demands it.
All the guns are locked in the forward position. It's too bad you decided not to repair the rear deflector shields.
I think the ending needed one more scene between Ahsoka and Anakin to solidify their growth. Because after the day is saved, all of the characters just look at each other for a moment and it's over. The bond between these two also feels disconnected from their goal of rescuing Jabba's son Rada to open up new trade routes for the Republic. And the protagonists have no stake in their mission, besides being ordered to complete it. The Separatists have this convoluted plan of trying to convince Jabba that the Jedi are trying to keep their son away from him.
Just let me do it.
I hate huts.
This specific method of trickery is known by most as pulling a Coolsville sucks.
You're doing that thing again where you take everything I say out of context. You're trying to make it look like I think Coolsville sucks. No! Don't record that!
Rada serves a similar purpose as the child from The Mandalorian, except he's just a farting plot device. Now we have an oddly specific trio of movies with child versions of their iconic characters that spun off into cartoons. Marketable babies aside, I think the idea of giving an irresponsible character like Anakin such a big responsibility in the form of Ahsoka is a good idea, since he's inherently more likable as a teacher, and this plot device comes with the built-in mystery of why she doesn't appear in Revenge of the Sith. However, within the confined runtime of this film, we only see Ahsoka grow in small ways, leaving room for her to be further developed in the TV show. That's a problem with this movie doubling as a pilot. It's a jumping off point, not a complete story, and that's why I feel that this should not have ended up in theaters. The opening Battle of Christophsis is long and somewhat dull, but it wraps up after a concise 25 minutes. As the movie moved on to its main set piece, I joked to myself that I felt like I had just watched the first episode. Turns out I'm a genius with incredible foresight because that's exactly what it was. This movie was just 4 episodes stitched together, and they were originally going to be titled The New Padawan, Castle of Deception, Castle of Doom, and Castle of Salvation. Played together, I think these would have functioned similarly to the premiere movies that Cartoon Network did to kick off some of their shows from the early 2000s, although The Clone Wars feels even less like a standalone story. The decision to hurl this thing into theaters came when George was reviewing footage and thought that the animation looked so quote-unquote beautiful that it should be released as a feature.
I saw it on the big screen at the first images came across, and I said, this is fantastic. This is too good to be a TV show. This should be a feature film.
The president of Lucasfilm's licensing at the time said that, sometimes George works in strange ways, and he was right on the money. As far as I can tell, the only deliberate difference between the movie and the show is the voice cast. You got a solid lineup of talent that would keep these roles for years, like James Arnold Taylor and D. Bradley Baker as half the cast, using the full power given to them by having 3 words in their name. But a few actors from the prequels reprised their roles, like Anthony Daniels as C-3PO, Christopher Lee as Count Dooku, and Samuel L. Jackson as himself. Good thing that 2 of these characters only have a combined total of 8 lines. Count Dooku is used well as the main villain here, but I kinda wish that he didn't have this disturbingly animated laugh. Most fans feel that the Clone Wars movie was not a good introduction to the series, and I'm inclined to agree. According to the official viewing guide, 2 episodes come before it in chronological order. They provide minor setup for the battle that opens the film, and while they probably could be watched in the order that they aired in, they give you a better feel of whether or not you'll like the show, and don't throw you into the action head first like the movie does. I know that technically it's a direct sequel to Attack of the Clones, but if you aren't familiar with where its characters ended up and what it set up, you're going to be lost within the first minute. The seams between each original episode are very visible too. Like, Padme gets a subplot with only 20 minutes left that could have worked decently within one chapter, but feels pointless to begin at a point where the movie is gearing up for the climax. In her storyline, Padme confronts a character named Zero the Hutt, whose appearance and vocal performance led some to believe that the character was homosexual. I know on the surface that sounds ridiculous, but the voice is admittedly very stereotypical.
You will regret this, Zero.
No, I think I will become rich with this.
The film's director and likely small-town sheriff Dave Filoni confirmed that this was not the case, and that Hutts are asexual, which does explain how Jabba can have a son. Luckily, it's not an Emperor Palpatine kind of situation. This is not the place to speculate upon those matters. You can do that on your own, with the help of today's sponsor, Squarespace. If you're looking for a slick new website to showcase your work or opinions, I recommend Squarespace. The interface is simple, making it easy to import a wide array of media, as well as market and sell your own products. There's even different options for getting support and picking up new tricks and tips. I like how much control you're given over the presentation of the website. You have the freedom to make a website for anyone, or just one person. Head over to squarespace.com to set up your site with a free trial, and when it's all ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/NICKtendo to save 10% off of your first purchase of a website or domain using the code NICKtendo. All in all, the Clone Wars movie is pretty decent. The visuals are unique but outdated, the story feels incomplete, and I don't really care about the characters. Outside of some forced humor with the battle droids, this isn't inherently more kid-friendly, but it is more character-focused, although it still has a bit of political drama that Star Wars fans know and begrudgingly accept. The back of the box also says that it's got brief language and momentary smoking, so it's clearly for big boys only. I like a lot of the smaller interactions between the main characters, even when some of their arcs don't go anywhere. They're charming without feeling forced.
You're reckless, little one. You never would have made it as Obi-Wan's Padawan. But you might make it as mine.
There definitely could have been a stronger vision behind the plot and animation, which isn't a surprise considering that this is a pilot, but I'm left wondering why there was so much animosity towards this when it came out. My best guess is that it's just a matter of perspective. The Clone Wars movie came out 3 years after Episode 3, having the same time gap between the previous films. Nowadays, we have all this different Star Wars content on TV and in theaters, but this was still a time when a Star Wars film was a big deal, and it was advertised as such. It was also attempting to enter a medium that is seen as mostly being for kids, while still maintaining the same appeal as its core titles, unlike the smaller TV projects it had done in the past. The trailer showed this by emphasizing the intense war aspects and had all this crazy action. But then, as I previously mentioned, the plot had significantly lower stakes compared to what came before it, and that must have left a salty taste in people's mouths. If this premiered on TV with the rest of the show, I think that more people would have understood that the Clone Wars was trying to do something smaller and something different. But because that's not how the George works, this is seen as the weakest entry in the whole franchise. I think this comfortably sits with Rogue One as a decent flick, and you can make an argument that it's better than the movies people usually consider to be quote-unquote the worst, which is almost half of them. And by that, I mean I'm going to do that right now. Number 1, it's unique. Having original ideas does not make this a great movie, but it does give it a specific identity. It acknowledges previous events and builds atop them by challenging characters and introducing iconic new ones. It rewards those who cared about the prequels, not people who wish they could have been rewritten. Number 2, it's short and simple. This is the shortest Star Wars movie, and while it could have used another set piece or scene in its ending, it doesn't aggressively waste your time, and the plot is easy to understand. It's not about complicated politics, and it doesn't go on for an extra half hour, unlike, well, most of this franchise actually. Number 3, it succeeded in what it was trying to do. The whole point of this movie was to set up the Cartoon Network show, and it did put that series on track for success. That goal might not have been as lofty as trying to tie into the rest of the saga, but it didn't try to be more than it was. Even if I think the distribution and execution of the film weren't the most ideal, it launched what has become a massive and beloved part of the Star Wars universe. One so loved that it survived its initial cancellation. You could attribute this to the show's rising quality in later seasons, but hey, it certainly made me interested enough to do a whole video on it. I don't think that this is the worst Star Wars movie, and it is certainly not the worst animated movie George Lucas has made. That's like the one universally accepted opinion in this video. I don't think it deserves to have such low ratings, but as is common for this franchise, the expectations going into it had a major impact on its reception. In the end, the scores on IMDb, Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic are just a general metric, and are always going to be biased. So go out and make your own opinions on this and the worst that Star Wars has to offer. There are no right answers. Except for The Phantom Menace. 3D. It's just the same stupid movie, except in 3D!